So this is the first big study that we're going to look at for your first year. This is Milgram 1963 study of obedience. It's one of the most famous studies in psychology. So, Milgram was a Jewish American. His parents were immigrants to America, and he grew up in New York. He grew up during the period just before World War II, and obviously lived through World War II in America. At the end of the war, everyone was astounded by what had happened to the Jewish people in Europe. Milgram himself had had family members killed in the camps in the Holocaust and things like that, and it was very much an idea at the time that the German people had done something horrifically wrong, which obviously we agree with, but their view at the time was that the German people were something different than others. Yeah, there's something about the German person or the German characteristics, personality or whatever, which made them capable of doing these horrible things that no one else on the planet could do. So that's what Milgram set out to study. So Milgram wanted to test the hypothesis: Germans are different. There's something about them, especially, that makes them capable of doing the atrocities that they did in the Second World War. So to do that, he needed to test the Germans against some other people, and he chose Americans. So the Americans were going to be the baseline. The Americans were going to be just the normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill people who don't do atrocious things. So Milgram set out first to get their score. So he's going to get the score of the Americans and then go off to Germany and get the score of obedience of the Germans to see how it differs. So the aim is to establish a baseline measure of how obedient participants would be when ordered to give an electric shock to an innocent victim. So Milgram put a newspaper article in a newspaper in Yale of America. So this was a copy of that newspaper article. What they were looking for is men from varying jobs: factory workers, clerks, businessmen, salespeople, basically any sort of job, but they asked for no students of either colleges or universities. Participants were to be paid $4 for taking part in the experiment, with 50 cents car fare for petrol, and they got that money regardless of whether they continued or not. Simply turning up at the experiment got them that $4.50. So remember, this is what we call a self-selecting sample, since they volunteered to take part from just an advert in the newspaper. Of the people that volunteered, Milgram took a sample of 40 males. These people were deceived, by the way. They were lied to about what the experiment was about. They were told that this was an experiment on the study of memory and learning, yet not that it was a study on obedience, because obviously if we told them it was a study on obedience, that would have affected their results. So the participants turned up and they met with another person that was taking part in the experiment, another learner. In truth, he was a Confederate, though. Remember, a Confederate is somebody who's in on the experiment. So he's just an actor who's playing along and pretending that he's a normal participant. This participant was Mr. Wallace, this guy here. So he's a middle-aged guy, little overweight, Irish descent. He was perfectly friendly and amicable to the real participant. So they he turned up and they talked for a while in the reception, until the experimenter, this guy in the lab coat and the tie, turns up. And he then explained a little bit about the experiment and put them through a draw to see who was going to be the teacher and who was going to be the learner. The teacher would be giving the electric shocks, the learner would be receiving the electric shocks. This draw, however, was rigged. Yeah, it was a fixed draw so that the real participant, not the Confederate, was always given the role of the teacher. Yeah, he was always going to be the one giving the electric shocks. So they went into another room, and what the teacher did first was he was wired up to this electrical generator and given a 45-volt shock. Yeah, this is so the teacher knew how much that these electric shocks would hurt. Yeah, so the real participant was given a real electric shock. And it's important to know that this was the only electric shock given in the entire experiment. All the other electric shocks, other than the one that the teacher got, were false. The Confederate, Mr. Wallace, just pretended to be getting them. So once the teacher had his electric shock, they wired up the learner, Mr. Wallace. So Mr. Wallace was wired up to the generator. And what they were doing was a word association test. So they were given the list of words, e.g. blue box, nice day, things like that. And then later the teacher would say blue, followed by 4 words: sky, ink, box or lamp. And Mr. Wallace had to press a button to say whether it's A, B, C or D. In this case it was C, obviously. Mr. Wallace is in a separate room, separated by a wall, so they never actually see him and things like that. It's just lights saying A, B, C or D flashing up on their machine. Here's a quick diagram of it, so you can see the participant, Mr. Wallace, separated by the wall. The experimenter, so again that guy in the tie, the lab coat, with a clipboard, would sit behind the experimenter and sit behind the teacher and monitor the experiment from there. Obedience was measured on how many volts they went up to. The generator ranged from 15 to 450 volts, so there's 30 switches labeled going up in increments of 15, going from everything from slight shock to dangerous severe shock. The final two, 450 and 435, were labelled XXX. They were labelled danger, severe shock, XXX, basically meaning this will kill a person if you go to this. The voltage increased by 15 shocks and 15 volts after each wrong answer. Mr. Wallace was, remember, giving wrong answers. And the entire point of the experiment is to get the electric shocks to be given to him. So every time he gave a wrong answer, they had to go up to the next level of shock. They had to go up to from 15 to 30, from 30 to 35. If Mr. Wallace didn't answer, if he just was silent, it counted as a wrong answer. So again, they would go up in that other 15 volt increment. So the learner, Mr. Wallace, up to 75 volts, he made no complaints whatsoever. He just pressed the button, got them right, got them wrong, things like that. At 120 volts, he started to complain the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he began to shout. 270 volts, there were agonizing screams. At 300 volts, he stopped answering altogether. Yeah, he basically indicated that he had died. So where do you think you would stop? So remember, you had to go up in 15 volt increments, given all these painful electric shocks. And at a certain point, he starts to scream. Or he starts to tell you he's uncomfortable to start with, and then he starts to scream in pain. Where do you think you would stop giving the electric shocks? I'm just going to give you a quick second to think about that before we move on. So once you've got that in mind, what if I added this extra bit on? Do you remember that experimenter? The guy who was in the lab coat, in the tie, very scientific, with a clipboard, very official, and the person who'd met you at the university? He gave you prods. So when you wanted to stop, say you got to 140 volts and you decided that these guys are too much pain, I want to stop. You tell the experimenter, I want to stop, and he turns to you and says, please continue. Yeah. Do you think you'd go any further? If you said you wanted to stop again, he turns to you and says, the experiment requires that you continue. If you wanted to stop again, say 30 volts later on, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Till eventually, when you wanted to stop again, you have no other choice, you must go on. These prods were there to put pressure on a person. And whenever they wanted to stop, you had to put the experimenter put a bit of pressure on them to get them to continue by using these 4 prods. If they asked again, once all these 4 prods had been used, the experiment finished. So what about now? Where do you think you would stop? Would you have went any further on? The key question is, how many out of 40 participants got all the way to the end? So this is what Milgram asked people. He went around and he asked some psychology students and some psychologists how many participants would go to 450 volts. Of the psychology students he asked, nobody thought many would go that high. The highest number guess was 3%. 3% of people will go to 450 volts. Milgram also asked some psychiatrists. Remember, these are the experts on human behaviour. And they predicted less than 1% of participants would go to 450 volts. That 1% is the percentage of the population that we thought were psychopaths at that point. So what about the real results? In Milgram's experiment, remember, of the 40 participants, all of the participants went to 300 volts. Yet every single person gave that 300 volt shock. This is, remember, when the person stopped responding. The first participant dropped out at 315 volts, but 100% got to 300. 65%, which is 26 out of 40, went to 450 volts. 65% of people gave every single shock they were told to. Only 14 people stopped before the very end, which is why we have a very ashamed looking Michael Fassbender. We also have a picture of a man who was in the actual experiment. In class, we'll watch a brief clip of this video, and you'll be able to see somebody actually going through the Milgram experiment. So these are the results just in the table. So 300 volts, 5 people stopped there. So every single person, remember, 100% gave the 300 volt shock, but then 5 of them dropped out before they got to 315 volts. And that's what this table shows. So it kind of goes back to the number before. All but 5 gave 315 volts, all but those 9 gave 330, and so on. This is a graph just briefly showing kind of the drop-off rate versus the predicted rate. As you can see, it is much higher than was predicted. The participants didn't do this easily though. They showed lots of problems like trembling, sweating, stuttering. Some had nervous laughter. Some dug their fingernails into their flesh. Like they dug the fingernails into the palms of their hands and stuff and drew blood. In a further experiment we did, not really our one, but in a further one, 3 participants had uncontrollable seizures. Yeah, they could not stop themselves doing the experiment even though they wanted to. The pressure put on them, the need to obey that experimenter, was so bad that they had a seizure. So the conclusion of Milgram's experiment is that Germans were not different. That was the idea going into it, remember. Well, Milgram found that Americans, these people who he thought would be all about freedom and choice and making their own decisions, they all gave the electric shocks as well. So it's the situation, such as the setting, the experimenter, the pressure, which caused the obedience and not a flaw in the German characteristics. Milgram concluded that anyone in the same situation would do the same behaviour. So that's it for this presentation, and we'll look at evaluation and a bit more about this study in class. Right, thanks, bye.